Hey, this is lesson 72 and it's all about increasing aggregate demand within the UK economy. Now, by now you should know there are a number of different ways in which we could increase aggregate demand in the UK economy. One of those is obviously through fiscal policy, either increasing government spending or decreasing income tax. However, the problem, particularly with increasing government spending, is that's going to make the national debt even worse. And okay, we can follow the Keynesian approach, which is that if you increase G via the multiplying accelerator, eventually that will lead to a rise in national income, and the government will get more tax returns back, and then they'll be able to pay off the initial deficit. But really, when the national debt is so high, this process actually becomes quite dangerous. And on top of that, you also get the crowding out effect, so there's less money available for the private sector. So therefore it's quite interesting to note when you read the report in the budget for 2011, that the government started to talk about monetary activism, which is a very strange term for the government to use. So clearly at that stage they were thinking that they may be able to use alternative monetary policy to get the economy moving. Now, having low interest rates at 0.5% is certainly very alternative, and it's never happened before. And that will clearly stimulate the economy, and it will also lower the exchange rate because hot money will move abroad. However, the government was even stronger than that in the sense that they started printing a lot of money, £360 billion worth. So we're going to have a look at the dangers of those policies. We obviously had to increase aggregate demand, and the government has succeeded in that policy because we've now got economic growth of 3%. We've got the term of expansionary fiscal contraction appears to be working. So really this session is all about the dangers of having very low interest rates, a low exchange rate, although I appreciate in 2014 it's suddenly gone up, and also printing a lot of money. And we don't fully recognise the problems yet of these policies. Personally, if you ask me, I don't think these policies will actually lead to inflation, because I believe there's a lack of demand within the UK economy. Does that mean that I think that inflation will cease to be a problem in the coming years? No. As an environmentalist, I'm pretty certain that energy prices, commodity prices, they're all going to go up in price, and that will lead to cost push inflation, and it's how we deal with that problem. Personally, I would obviously prefer intervention supply side economics in terms of putting money and maybe even printing money to reduce the price of the essential commodities and in particular oil, and also through innovation, look at new ways of producing goods. However, what I'm here for is to teach you how to pass A2 level economics, and this is now what I'm going to talk about. So one of the main government objectives, the main objective of the Bank of England, has always traditionally been to make sure that inflation is low, and inflation always was low in the last decade. In fact, it was always around about 2%, so the government was keeping to its target, so therefore we had macro stability. Then 2008 comes along and there's a lack of demand within the economy, so what's the government going to do about it? The first thing it did was it increased government spending, so did all the countries in Europe, so did America. That led to a rise in national debt. However, it did also lead to a rise in aggregate demand. But obviously, this rise in national debt is getting to dangerous levels. Remember, at this time, the government did have a sustainable investment rule, is that national debt should not rise beyond more than 40% of GDP. Well, by the year 2013, we're now at 80% of GDP. The problem with national debt is it leads to the crowding out effect, higher interest payments because you may lose your AAA, AAA rating. Well, we already have lost our AAA rating, it may even get even worse than that. It may become BBB, and we may end up like Greece, whereby they're charged 30% rate of interest if they want to borrow money. Okay, so in 2011 we got this plan for growth, which I've already spoken about today, or in a previous couple of lessons, and we're using this term called monetary activism, whatever that means. Well, obviously what it did mean was that the government was going to have very low interest rates, a very low exchange rate, and they were also going to print £360 billion worth to stimulate the economy. Now, to me, that makes a lot of sense because at that period of time, as you know, we had a negative output gap and we had to increase aggregate demand. and low interest rates will obviously increase aggregate demand. A low exchange rate will increase aggregate demand through a fall in export prices. However, the thing that I want to introduce you today is the fact of MV equals PT. Now, this was a monetarist idea, and basically they saw a very, very strong connection between the money supply and inflation. Now, what is the money supply? The money supply is really, in simple terms, is how much money is going around the economy, obviously, but it can also increase dramatically if the banks decide to lend out loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of money. Then the money supply can increase. And clearly this did happen between 1997 and the year 2007. However, the price rises all went into the housing market and the stock market. So if you owned assets during that period of time, then those prices shot up. But the monetarist argument, very, very simply, is if you increase the money supply, that will directly lead to a rise in inflation. Even to the extent that they said that if the money supply, say, went up by 10%, then we would also expect inflation to go up by 10%. So there was a direct link between the two. MV equals PT. So you're probably asking now, what the hell does V stand for and what does T stand for? V stands for velocity of circulation, which is really how many times the money goes around the economy in a year. And T stands for transactions, which are the number of transactions that are made. Now, monetarists believed that V and T were stable. So this was their theory, and if V and T are stable, obviously an increase in money supply will directly lead to inflation. And you obviously know that it's in people's DNA that if you print money, people will always reply back, well, that will always lead to inflation. Well, we printed £360 billion worth, and so far inflation has fallen over the last few years, but it is likely to create inflation, which is why I'm going to explain that process now. We've already looked at this monetarist diagram slightly earlier on in the course, and it says that the long aggregate supply curve is vertical, and if we increase AD, that will always lead to a rise in inflation. Can you remember going through A, B and C, which says if we increase aggregate demand, then that would reduce unemployment, but then there'd be a shortage of workers in the labour market. Those workers would then ask for higher wages, and that would shift the short and aggregate supply curve to the left, and we would end up with higher inflation. Okay, so obviously there's a lot of danger involved. If we do have low interest rates, that could lead to a big rise in demand via the transmission mechanism. It's cheaper for people to borrow money, therefore consumption goes up, therefore investment goes up. In particular, house prices will rise, therefore that will increase aggregate demand, therefore that could lead to demand pull inflation. However, I think that's quite unlikely at this moment in time. There is another negative effect in the fact that it will destroy savings. All those old people who want to save loads and loads of money all rely on the rate of interest rate being higher because they're going to get a greater return on their savings. Obviously, with an interest rate of 0.5%, their pensions are going to be hit hard. The next one is a lower exchange rate. Interest rate falls, therefore hot money goes abroad, therefore we have a lower exchange rate. That could obviously lead to cost push inflation. Will directly lead to cost push inflation, and we spoke about this before. Remember talking about the Marshall-Lerner and the J curve. In fact, that if the price of oil goes up, we still need to demand more oil because it's an inelastic demand. So therefore, that will in fact create cost push inflation. But I'm really interested in this part of the course here, which is the printing money bit and what actually does happen. So printing money has definitely given the UK economy more confidence. The economists who worked it out say that this has led to a rise in growth of 2% a year, which has probably saved us from entering a double dip and even a triple dip recession. But if you do print money, then the banks have more money. The banks do have more money, so hopefully they would lend it out to businesses. But sadly, this may not be the case, and it appears that this hasn't always been as strong as we hoped it would be. What's tending to happen is the banks have more money, so once again they've been now lending more of that money out to the housing market. There's various schemes involved with the government, which is the help to buy schemes. This is stimulating the housing market, so the housing market is rising quickly. Now, in one way, this is good because if house prices go up by 10%, everybody therefore feels wealthier. If people feel wealthier, they're going to spend more money. But the problem is, once again, the UK economy is being pushed forward by the housing market, and that happened during the nice decades. So we're replicating those conditions again. So that is a potential consequence which may cause inflation. However, if you can remember that the housing market for some unknown reason is not in the definition of inflation, which is a little bit weird. The other thing, perhaps more serious from my point of view, is that banks have all this cash. Now, if you're a banker, what you want to do is you want to maximize those returns, because if you maximize those returns, then your commission is going to go up. So what you do, you go out throughout the whole world and you decide to buy up commodities, because commodities are definitely in short supply. So therefore that will push prices up of oil, maize, wheat, copper, zinc. All those things are likely to rise in price, and that will therefore create inflation, and that will therefore create cost push inflation. So that, I think, has been a major consequence of that. If we add on the process that as the world economy starts to recover, there's going to be more demand, particularly from China, India. The Asian economies are going to get stronger and stronger. The UK economy is growing at 3%. America's now growing at 3%. They're going to demand more goods. And as the population goes up, and as world demand goes up, it is more likely that we will get inflation. Okay, right now we haven't got inflation because there's a lack of demand, particularly in Europe, may even be suffering from deflation. But the problem is we have in fact been spending, so we have been printing a lot of money, and eventually there is an element of truth in this. If you print money, that will lead to some knock-on effect of inflation. However, what alternative did the government have in 2011? Could it continue to have increased government spending, which would have led to a rise in the national debt, which would have led to all of those problems? Or could they have just printed money? I suspect they made the right decision. However, the big question is, should they have printed the money and given it to the people who created the problem or the credit crunch in the first place, which was the banks who lent out too much money? So eventually the argument is, okay, we do want to increase aggregate demand. It's going to be difficult to increase aggregate demand because if we increase G, we have all the national debt problems. Fine, we got those. So therefore we used a much more aggressive monetary policy to stimulate the economy, including printing money. And if you print money, that brings in the point of MV equals PT, which is why in the year 2014, at long last, the examiners decided to ask a question on MV equals PT, which hadn't been asked for about 7 or 8 years. And the previous question actually had been, is monetarism dead? Now, to a certain degree, they are correct. There was never a really strong link between the money supply and inflation, not to the extent that the monetarists believed it was, if the money supply goes up by 10%, inflation will also go up by 10%. That wasn't really correct. But what was correct was if there is an increase in the money supply, it will probably lead to inflation at some stage. And I've shown the way that they printed the money and they're giving it to the banks by buying up government bonds from the banks, is that I believe there will be consequences in terms of commodity price inflation leading to cost push inflation.